The room was never meant to be a gallery. It was just the corner of an old house where light didn't reach properly, where the wallpaper peeled not from age but from indifference. A small wooden chair leaned against the wall, not because someone had sat in it recently, but because no one had dared to move it in years. The floor was a quilt of faded carpet patches, each telling its own quiet story of spills and steps and waiting. And on the far wall, crooked as if placed by unsure hands, hung the painting. No plaque, no frame of grandeur, just a canvas that had always been there, according to those who'd lived in the house longest. They never spoke of it directly, but they never forgot to dust it either. As if acknowledging its presence without fully confronting it had become part of the architecture itself. During the day, the painting appeared ordinary, if a little unsettling. It depicted a room much like the one it hung in, though subtly off. The corners were deeper. The shadows leaned wrong. The chair inside the painted room was turned just slightly more toward the wall. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the afternoon sun caught the canvas at an angle, the light in the painting would shimmer ever so faintly. Not as a reflection, but as though the painting itself possessed its own illumination. People would glance at it and move on, with the same slight discomfort one feels when realizing a mannequin is too lifelike or a mirror reflects what shouldn't be there. No one stared for long, and no one ever touched it. Except at night, the painting did not look the same. At night, the canvas shifted, not with movement, but with meaning. The colors deepened like bruises, and what was once shadow now seemed solid. The room within the painting became fuller, darker, more defined. The chair's position changed minutely, always just enough to feel intentional. Objects appeared where none had been before. A teacup on the floor, a crack in the ceiling, a handprint on the wall. And the window in the background, which had been closed during the day, appeared ajar by moonlight, leaking a dim silver light that didn't match any real-world source. Those who passed by the painting in the dark often did so quickly, with the same urgency as one avoids looking into open closets or down unlit hallways. Some said it was imagination, others said the house was old, but all agreed, quietly and without argument, that the painting was different when the lights were out. There was no record of who had first placed the painting on the wall. The deeds of the house mentioned renovations, changes in ownership, generations passing through, but never art. And yet, the painting had never been moved, never been catalogued, never been explained. Some assumed it came with the house. Others, more quietly, suspected the house had formed around it. Over time, the residents had learned to live with it the way one lives with old radiators that groan at night, or floorboards that creak in rhythm with memory. When guests came to visit, they were rarely shown that room. Not out of secrecy, but out of something closer to shame, like admitting you own something you don't understand but can't throw away. The few who did wander into the room on their own often emerged quiet, brushing at their arms as if a cold draft had passed through them, though no vent or window explained it. Some neighbors told stories about the painting aging differently than the rest of the room. When the wallpaper curled and faded, the canvas remained oddly pristine. No dust settled on it, despite the lack of attention. Once, a young boy had tried to draw on it with crayon while visiting. The crayon snapped in his hand before it touched the fabric, and he hadn't entered the room since. The family never scolded him, because they knew they hadn't needed to. That night, they claimed, he had woken up crying from a dream he couldn't describe, but which had left damp footprints on his bedroom floor. His mother placed salt in each corner of his room after that, and they painted the walls white. The dreams stopped, but the painting, of course, remained. Each new tenant treated the painting with reluctant respect. Some tried to hang curtains to hide it, but they never stayed up. The rods would fall, screws would bend, and the cloth would slide off, as if the wall itself rejected coverings. Others claimed to hear soft creaks at night, like footsteps in the room, even when the door was closed. A woman once lived in the house who tried to remove it altogether. She brought a crowbar and a bucket of white paint. She was methodical. Tap around the frame, feel for nails, but she found none. The painting was flush with the wall, as though painted onto it, yet not quite part of it. When she tried to cover it with paint, the white turned to gray, then to black. Not by blending, but by absorption. She left it unfinished and moved out before the month was over. She never asked for her deposit back. Years later, an older couple moved in, one of them nearly blind, the other mostly deaf. They never noticed the painting, or at least never commented on it. The silence between them and the canvas was mutual, like a pact between things that could no longer change. But once, during a particularly long and moonless winter, the man swore he saw a fireplace in the painting flicker to life. The next night, their actual fireplace refused to light, no matter how dry the wood. And when they sat in the cold, the warmth seemed to hum from the direction of the painting. They placed a chair in front of it and sat together in the dark, not speaking, not watching, just feeling something that might have been memory, or something else entirely. As years passed, the painting became part of the stories told by the town, though always secondhand. No one claimed to know it intimately. Everyone knew someone who had lived with it, seen it, felt it. It became one of those quiet landmarks, like the tree that never shed its leaves or the dog that never barked. You didn't point it out, but you also didn't forget it. Children dared each other to touch it on Halloween nights, but the dares were rarely completed. Some claimed it was cold to the touch, others said it wasn't there at all when they reached out. One child screamed when her shadow disappeared while standing in front of it, only to return the moment she stepped away. Her parents told her it was imagination, but they stopped using that room afterward. It became storage again. Boxes piled up in front of the painting, but none ever leaned on it. Even clutter showed caution. During one summer, when the house was unoccupied, a local artist was hired to repaint the interior. He brought scaffolding and supplies, planning to refresh every wall. But when he reached that corner room, he paused. Something about the light made him uneasy. The rest of the house bathed in warm sun, but this room swallowed it. He painted the other walls quickly, deliberately leaving the one with the painting for last. When he finally approached it, the sun had shifted, and the painting reflected none of it. He leaned closer, brush in hand, but felt a sudden nausea, as if leaning over a precipice. He backed away, packed up, and never sent a bill. When asked why, he simply said, "It didn't want to be painted over," and never elaborated again. Sometimes, the painting mirrored real changes in the house. A crack that appeared on the ceiling would show up a day later on the painted version, just slightly longer, more splintered. When a new lamp was added to the room, a vague glow began to emerge in the painting's shadows, but never in the same place. And one evening, after a visiting niece dropped a porcelain cup on the carpet, the painting depicted a shattered pattern beneath the chair, though the actual fragments had been swept away. It was as though the painting not only reflected the room, but also remembered it, like a diary kept in oil and canvas. It didn't always show what was, but sometimes what had been, or what might have happened. Those who paid attention noticed, and those who didn't still felt the shift in air whenever the painting changed, even if they couldn't say how or why. A man once lived there alone, a historian who never married. He loved records, accuracy, timelines. He cataloged the entire house, floor plans, fixtures, even aging patterns in the wood. But the painting defied his notes. It changed without consistency, without logic. He set up a camera to watch it at night, hoping to capture the shifts. The next morning, the footage was blank, white noise and static. The camera's memory card melted inside the device as if exposed to heat, though the room remained cold. He tried again with another camera, then a third. Each time, failure. Finally, he stopped trying and began sketching what he saw each morning. Over time, his sketches grew darker, more frantic, as though trying to catch a thought that wouldn't hold still. When he passed away, his journal was found full of drawings. On the last page, the painting was gone entirely. In its place, only the word "inside." Now, the house sits mostly empty, maintained by a distant cousin who inherited it through paperwork, not sentiment. She visits occasionally to ensure the walls still stand, that the pipes haven't burst. But she never stays long. Her eyes never quite meet the painting. She once tried to move furniture into the room, to turn it into a study. The chair she brought in broke as she crossed the threshold. The desk refused to fit through the doorframe, though its measurements had matched. She gave up, calling the room the dark one, and left it alone. Dust collected again, in every corner except the one occupied by the painting. Even the cobwebs skirted around its frame, as if out of politeness or fear. She never tried to paint over it, nor photograph it. She simply learned to move quickly past that part of the hallway, the way one avoids eye contact with strangers on empty streets. Still, the painting waits. It does not call, does not threaten, does not beg. It simply remains, a presence that shifts only when unobserved, that holds not just pigment, but memory, not just form, but suggestion. At night, when the moon slips through the cracked blinds, the painting seems to breathe. Not visibly, not audibly, but perceptibly. In that way, old buildings sometimes inhale. Those who have lived with it carry something after. A hesitation in dark rooms, a tendency to glance behind them when passing mirrors, a discomfort with art that feels too still. The painting doesn't haunt, it lingers. And as the house grows older, as footsteps grow fewer, it remains young in a way that feels wrong, as though time avoids it, as though it remembers what came before the walls were built, and perhaps what will come after they fall. The cousin who now held the keys to the house never admitted aloud what she felt in the painted room. She was a pragmatic woman, used to ledgers and invoices, to the weight of inherited obligations. The house had been a surprise, a line in a will from someone she barely remembered. She accepted it out of politeness and caution, thinking she could renovate it, sell it, let it go. But from the moment she entered, something shifted. The house was not hostile, not eerie in the cinematic sense. It was just too aware. The air inside didn't carry dust. It carried attention, as if the walls themselves waited to see how she would move, what she would touch. The rest of the rooms played along with her logic. Floors could be sanded, lights replaced. But the painted room defied her presence. When she opened its door, it felt like stepping into the middle of a conversation that had paused too suddenly. The silence inside was not empty. It was waiting to resume. One afternoon, against better judgment, she brought in a guest. Not a friend, not quite. An appraiser, sent to evaluate the potential value of the house and perhaps the painting, if it had any. He wore gloves and glasses and a jacket with too many pockets. He walked the perimeter of the room, avoiding the painting at first, commenting instead on wood rot, air quality, insulation. But then his gaze settled, not on the painting itself, but on the space around it. He didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he stepped closer, close enough to reach out, though he didn't. His hand hovered, fingers bent, then retreated. "This wasn't made by accident," he said, barely above a whisper. "But I don't know if it was made by a person." She tried to press for details, but he only shook his head and began gathering his things. "Whatever it is," he said at the door, "it's not finished." He never sent a report. When she called his office, they said he had resigned 2 days earlier, citing personal reasons. She never called again. After that, she stopped entering the room. But that didn't stop the room from entering her. At night, in her own apartment miles away, she began to see strange shifts in her peripheral vision. Furniture in the wrong place, a lamp that flickered in the exact rhythm of her heartbeat. Once she woke with paint under her fingernails, dark, matte, unyielding. She hadn't painted anything in years. Her therapist suggested stress. Her neighbor suggested sage. But nothing soothed the quiet certainty that something had followed her. Not a spirit, not a curse, but an observation. The feeling of being unfinished, as if her shape was still being decided. She returned to the house only once more that season, just before autumn began to stain the trees with warning. Her intention had been simple: retrieve a box of family photographs stored in the upstairs closet. She told herself she would not enter the painted room, would not even walk past it. But the house had a way of turning every intention into a suggestion. The air was cooler than expected, thick with silence that did not belong to absence, but rather to listening. As she walked the hallway, the floorboards did not creak the way she remembered. They held their breath beneath her steps. When she reached the closet, the door opened before she touched the handle, gently, as if the house approved of her purpose. The box was there, labeled in old ink, tied shut with twine. But as she turned to leave, the door to the painted room stood open. She had not opened it. She was certain. And yet it gaped, just slightly ajar, revealing only the edge of the canvas inside. It was darker than it should have been. The window in the room was unshuttered, yet the light from outside refused to enter. She told herself to keep walking. Instead, her foot moved, then the other. It wasn't possession. It was something simpler. Curiosity stripped of safety. The painting looked different again. The room it depicted was familiar, yes, but something new had emerged. A second figure. Not a person, not exactly, but a shape. Humanoid, seated in the painted chair, with its head tilted too far to one side. It had no features, just the suggestion of presence. Her mouth went dry. The box of photographs slipped from her grasp, landing with a muted thump. In the painting, the figure turned its head, not in animation, but in implication. The angle had changed. The pose had changed. And behind it on the painted wall was a new painting. A painting within the painting, showing yet another room, smaller, closer. That night, she dreamt of corridors. Not nightmares, not quite, just endless transitions. Hallways that bent in impossible directions, doors that led to other doors, each with a smaller knob. At the end of one such hallway was a room that resembled the painted one, though dimmer, narrower, heavier in atmosphere. She stood before its version of the canvas, but instead of paint, the surface rippled like water disturbed by breath. She reached toward it and woke up before contact. Her fingers were damp with something clear, odorless. Her apartment lights flickered twice before steadying. The dreams came again the following night, and again the next, until she stopped sleeping entirely. Or perhaps she was sleeping, but in a different way, spread across spaces, seeing from places her body didn't occupy. She began sketching compulsively. Small things at first, windows within windows, rooms that watched back, a chair always at a slight angle. Then came the eyes, hundreds of them, never attached to faces, just hovering within the shapes of corners and ceilings. She filled notebooks with these sketches, but they always ended up near the painted room. She would find them resting just inside the doorframe whenever she visited the house again, though she never remembered bringing them with her. One notebook in particular began to draw itself. She'd leave it closed on a desk, return hours later to find new pages filled in. Once, she caught a glimpse of the pen moving without hand. It wasn't automatic writing. It was observation becoming record. Eventually, she stopped questioning the painting. It had no answers to give, only questions mirrored through shifting imagery. Every time she looked at it now, there was something else added, something subtle, recursive. One afternoon, it showed her standing in front of it, not her reflection, but her silhouette, mid-motion. And behind that version of herself, another shadow, one she couldn't identify. The painting was becoming a memory of things she hadn't done yet, or perhaps had done in another frame of time. The cousin stopped speaking of the house entirely. When asked by distant relatives or concerned friends, she offered vague responses. It's still there, or nothing's changed. But internally, she knew the painting was no longer just in the house. It had begun to be the house. The architecture seemed to fold more tightly around it with each visit. The room's dimensions no longer obeyed her measurements. Once, she stepped inside and found the walls closer together than before, like lungs exhaling inward. The painting loomed larger too, though she had never moved it, never touched it. It didn't grow in frame, but in implication, as if claiming more space not physically, but perceptually. Visitors avoided that room instinctively. Plumbers, electricians, inspectors, they all felt the same hesitation, the same reluctance to linger near it. One technician refused to enter at all after peering through the threshold. "The perspective's wrong," he muttered, eyes wide. "The lines don't add up." No one laughed. No one corrected him. Even service dogs growled when led near the door, their hackles rising as though sensing a predator too still to be seen. Over time, the room ceased to register on blueprints. The cousin discovered this while trying to insure the property. No assessor could find documentation for that section of the house. It was as though the space had blinked out of legal existence. But she knew better. The painting was simply refusing to be known in conventional ways. One night, she heard a knock, not on her apartment door, but from within her mind. Not sound, but the memory of sound. A rhythm, gentle but deliberate. When she opened her eyes, the shadows on her ceiling had formed the outline of a frame. Inside it, darkness shimmered faintly, waiting to be filled. She closed her eyes again and tried to forget. But forgetting was no longer an option. The painting remembered for her. It remembered everything. She began leaving the light on at night, not because she was afraid of the dark, but because darkness had become unfamiliar. Or worse, it had become too familiar. The painting changed in the dark, yes, but so did everything else now. Her own apartment grew shadows that didn't match the fixtures. Her reflection delayed by a fraction in the mirror, just long enough to notice. Books on her shelf rearranged themselves, not in placement, but in emphasis, as though the titles she didn't read began to fade, and the ones she feared began to bold themselves. The world was being recurated around her attention, and it all traced back to that room, that canvas. She tried rituals, not from belief, but from desperation. Salt across thresholds, candles in circles, recordings of white noise played on loop. None of it stopped the dreams. None of it returned the room to what it had been. Once, she visited during a thunderstorm, hoping the natural violence would override whatever subtle order the painting obeyed. But the rain made the canvas glisten unnaturally. It looked wet, alive, as if what it showed wasn't a representation anymore, but a portal held open by pigment. That night, lightning struck a tree just outside the window of the painted room. The next morning, the same tree appeared in the canvas, burnt, split, steaming. But outside, the real tree stood whole. Reality had begun to diverge, not split, not fracture, but blur. She couldn't say which version of events belonged to which world anymore. Her emails sometimes sent themselves. Her clocks reversed direction without stopping. And on her arm, a faint mark began to appear. Not a bruise, not a scar, but a line, as if drawn by brush. It extended slowly over days, curving, deliberate. She never completed the shape. She didn't want to know what it formed. She feared it might be a doorway. There came a morning when she realized she could no longer see the painting clearly in photographs, not just blurry or distorted, blank. Every picture she had taken showed the wall, the chair, the light. But where the canvas should have been, there was only white space, as though the image had refused capture. Even sketches betrayed her. Her hand would move, but what appeared was never quite what she saw. The brush strokes too fluid, the shadows too sentient. Once, she sketched what she thought was an empty room, only to find later that the figure had returned. The same tilted head, the same unreadable posture. But this time, it looked directly out. Not at her sketch, at her. She placed all her drawings in a trunk and locked it, buried it beneath other boxes. But still, she dreamt of the pages turning themselves, whispering in a language made of rustling and charcoal. One night, she woke to find a new drawing on her nightstand, one she had never seen before. It showed her, older, seated in front of the painting, with her hand extended, not toward the canvas, but into it, as if merging, as if being remembered by it. That was the night she decided never to return. She left the house keys in a drawer, locked the door, and walked away. Not from the house, but from the frame the painting had built around her life. But leaving changed nothing. The painting no longer needed walls. It had followed her, not in space, but in perception. She began to see frames in places they didn't belong. On subway windows, in puddles, reflected in strangers' glasses, always empty, always waiting. She stopped looking into mirrors altogether, not out of fear of what she'd see, but out of fear that she wouldn't see herself at all, just the faint outline of a figure, sitting in a chair, inside a room that had never been hers to begin with. The house did not remain empty. Emptiness is a human term based on absence, but some spaces are never truly vacant, only paused, waiting for a new rhythm to accompany their ongoing melody. Years passed without tenants, but the painted room did not gather dust. The air inside remained unnaturally even, neither warm nor cold, dry nor humid. Its stillness wasn't the kind born of quietude, but of attention, like the hush of a stage before the curtain rises. Eventually, a new figure entered the story. A man, middle-aged, disheveled not from neglect but from distraction. He had inherited the house through a legal fluke, some great-uncle twice removed whose name he didn't recognize. The man arrived not with ambition, but with retreat. He was running from something, not dramatic, not criminal, just weary. A life that had asked too many questions without waiting for answers. He saw the painting on his second day. Noticed it, really. On the first day he had moved boxes, unplugged the fridge, checked for leaks. The room with the painting had remained closed, as if both sides agreed on a postponement. But on the second morning, he opened the door out of idle curiosity. The light was strange, not bright, not dim, just sideways, as if the source came from a memory rather than the window. The painting did not alarm him. It intrigued. He was not a skeptic, nor a believer. He simply lacked the energy to be surprised. The painting, for its part, offered no greeting. It only was. A presence wrapped in linen and oil, curved slightly with age, or with waiting. The room within the painting mirrored his new space, as it had for others before him. But this time, the details were different. The chair had changed. A coat lay over its back. A book sat open on the floor. He did not recognize the book, but he felt as though he had read it. He left the room without closing the door, and that night he dreamed not of the painting, but of things adjacent to it. A hallway with no lights, a window with no glass, a knock, but not on a door, on wood held in memory. The next morning, the book from the painting appeared in his real room, on the floor, open to the same unreadable page. The words danced when he stared, not moved, danced. He blinked, and the book was blank. But he remembered something from the page. A shape. A word that wasn't a word. He tried to draw it, but found his fingers still. He tried to forget it, but found his thoughts looping. The painting hadn't welcomed him. It had acknowledged him. And that, somehow, was worse. The man did not speak of the painting. Not to neighbors, not to himself. He treated it like a storm cloud on the horizon, seen, acknowledged, but never invited. He began spending longer hours in the painted room, not out of fascination, but because it was quiet in a way other rooms weren't. His phone lost signal there. His watch lagged behind. The outside world seemed to pause at the threshold. He brought a chair in, not the one from the painting, but similar, and placed it near the window. From there, he read, or tried to. The words on his pages seemed softer, less certain, as though the stories didn't trust themselves anymore. He wrote in a journal too, though his entries grew shorter with time, less articulate, more visual, swirls of ink, boxes within boxes. Sometimes he'd close the book, only to find new marks the next morning. He began to notice patterns in the painting. Not changes this time. Patterns. Recurrences. A certain angle of light that appeared only when he felt sad. A crack in the painted wall that deepened when he woke from certain dreams. And sometimes the painted version of the room showed things he hadn't yet done, but soon would. Once, it showed a mug on the floor. 2 days later, he dropped his coffee. Another time, the chair in the painting was gone. The next week, his own chair splintered under him. He didn't replace it. He simply sat on the floor. He felt, increasingly, that the painting wasn't merely observing. It was preparing. A rehearsal of moments. A blueprint not for what was, but for what might be constructed from the sediment of his decisions. And yet, he didn't fear it. Not exactly. There was something almost comforting about the certainty it offered. He no longer had to wonder what he looked like when alone. He could see himself in oil and light, replicated in posture and expression. He stopped shaving, stopped adjusting his clothes. The man in the painting never blinked, and neither did he sometimes. It wasn't a loss of self. It was a merging, a blending of outline with reflection, of possibility with recollection. One evening, he lit a candle and set it near the canvas. The flame in the painting responded, not mirrored, but echoed. It flickered as if wind passed through the painted air. And for the first time, he smiled. Not from joy, from understanding. The house began to adopt his rhythm. Or perhaps he began to adopt the house's. It became difficult to tell. He no longer followed clocks. Meals arrived when he was hungry, though he never remembered preparing them. Lights turned on at dusk without switch. The floor no longer creaked. Even the insects seemed to avoid the corners of the painted room. Dust didn't settle. Nothing aged. The house had become a stillness machine, a place suspended between moments. And within that stillness, the painting flourished. It grew, not in size, not in surface, but in intention. Where once it had been a mimicry of space, now it was a pressure, a suggestion that expanded. The painted version of the room grew clearer, while the real one grew softer. Furniture in his world became indistinct, as if fogged by memory. But the painting's objects were sharp, textured, undeniable. He noticed things in it he no longer saw in the house itself. A crack above the window, a missing floorboard, a threadbare spot on the rug. Once, he tried to fix the real rug's corner and found it seamless. But in the painting, it remained frayed, as if the painting had declared what was real and what was not, and the room had obeyed. He stopped, leaving the house. The outside world began to feel two-dimensional, unreliable. Conversations faltered. Grocery stores hummed too loudly. People stared too long. And the sky. There was something wrong with the sky. Too clean, too wide, too expectant. Inside, the house curled around him like a shell, and the painting, always the painting, remained steady. He tried to photograph it once. The screen went black. He tried to sketch it again. The lines refused to cooperate. Eventually, he stopped trying to capture it and simply let it be, and the painting, in return, began to offer more. A door appeared in the painted wall, one that didn't exist in his world, yet. He resisted the urge to open the real wall where the painted door had appeared. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was respect, or perhaps it was fear of confirming that nothing would be there, or worse, that something would. Instead, he watched the door in the painting. It never opened, never moved, but it waited. He began to imagine what lay behind it, within the painted dimensions. A hallway, a staircase, another painting, and then one night, the door was ajar, just slightly, enough to see the faintest sliver of something warm, amber light, dust floating, perhaps even breath. The next morning, the painting had changed again. The door was open wider, and the chair, the one in the painted room, was now empty. That same day, he felt his own chair vanish beneath him, though he hadn't moved. It wasn't physical. The seat remained, but the weight of him felt unsupported, as if gravity had loosened, as if the house had less interest in holding him to the floor. He tried to distract himself with television, with books, with cleaning, but nothing retained shape. Words blurred, walls curved, time thickened. And always, when he looked into the painted room, the figure was gone, the door was open, and the light within looked inviting. He began to sleep in the painted room, not on the bed. He no longer used beds, just curled against the wall, facing the canvas, waiting. He woke with dust in his mouth, not the taste of neglect, but the texture of old attics, forgotten pages. Each morning, the painting seemed closer, not hung lower, not moved, but closer, as if it leaned toward him, as if the frame itself had begun to inhale. The room felt quieter now, not in absence of sound, but in the presence of listening. The house was no longer just shelter, it was becoming skin. Eventually, he reached toward the canvas. Not to touch it, just to see if his hand would be accepted. It wasn't, but something else happened. His shadow, cast by the dim lamp behind him, did not align with his movement. It hesitated, lagged. For the first time, he saw it look in a different direction than he did, toward the painting, as if it had noticed something he could not. He stood still. The shadow didn't. It moved closer to the painting, narrowing as if through a funnel. Then, slowly, it returned, reattached, but he could no longer say it was his. He tried again days later, holding a mirror to the canvas. In the reflection, the painting looked wrong. Not different, wrong, angled, tilted in a way the wall didn't allow. And inside it, the chair was gone, entirely. The room beyond the painted door seemed larger, and at the far end of that painted hallway, he thought he saw another painting, smaller, hanging crooked, familiar. He dropped the mirror. It didn't shatter, but the reflection remained cracked. From that moment on, he stopped testing the painting, not out of fear, out of acceptance. He began to prepare, not with packing or writing or any ritual of departure, but with presence. He spent longer hours sitting silently in the real room, mimicking the posture of the painted figure. He watched for small changes, dust patterns, shadow angles, glimmers of light that came from nowhere, and the painting, ever responsive, began to paint him back. One night, he saw his reflection in the canvas, not just his likeness, but his movement. He raised his hand and the figure within did the same, not a beat behind, simultaneous. It was not a reflection. It was a decision. And it had already been made. On the last day he was seen, the house was silent. A neighbor passed by and noticed the door was slightly ajar. This was unusual. He had never left it that way. But the wind wasn't strong, and nothing seemed disturbed. Curious, the neighbor stepped inside. The furniture was in place. The air smelled of old paper and something faintly metallic. The rooms paused, as though someone had just stepped out and would return any moment, except the painted room. That room was different. The light inside it was wrong, too golden, too slow. The painting still hung on the wall, but it had changed. Now, it showed the man seated inside the painted version of the painted room, looking out, not at the viewer, but beyond the frame, as if awaiting something larger. The real room's chair was gone. No clothes, no trace of departure. Just the painting, now richer in tone, deeper in shade. And inside it, the door in the painted hallway was closed once more. The neighbor didn't stay long. He left without touching anything, closed the front door gently, and didn't mention what he saw for many weeks. But that night, in his own home, he dreamt of a room he'd never entered, but now knew by heart. And on his bedroom wall, in the soft glow of the streetlight outside, he thought he saw the outline of a frame beginning to form. Not painted, not carved, just present. A suggestion waiting for permission to become memory. The house remained, as old houses tend to do. It neither mourned nor celebrated the absence of its last inhabitant. The walls held the same temperature, the windows filtered the same skewed light, and the painting stayed on the wall as though it had never known motion. But something within the architecture had quieted, a shift too subtle for measurement, but unmistakable in sensation. The air no longer pressed inward, the floor no longer adjusted its creak to passing footsteps, and the painted room, though unchanged in its arrangement, had adopted a different kind of silence. It was not the silence of waiting. It was the silence of conclusion. Yet the painting itself had not finished. Its brush strokes, once deliberate and smooth, now shimmered faintly at the edges, like heat above pavement. The colors had deepened not from age, but from intention, as though something behind the canvas had stepped closer to the surface. Visitors to the house, few and incidental, never stayed long. Realtors tried occasionally to list the property, but the listing never uploaded properly. Files vanished, photos turned blank. An intern once tried to post the listing through a third-party site and found his monitor filled with static when he hovered over the painting's image. He laughed it off, closed his laptop, and resigned the next morning without giving notice. The house became one of those that lived on through rumor, not haunted, not cursed, just unavailable. The kind of house that you pass while walking, slow your pace without realizing, then quicken again with no explanation. A house that remembers you after you forget it. A place where the windows do not reflect the weather, but something deeper and more consistent than seasons. And in time, people stopped trying to enter altogether. Nature began to reclaim its share. Vines curled around porch beams. Dust crept in through the cracks. Yet the painted room remained untouched. Not a cobweb crossed its corners. No mold ever reached its baseboards. The air inside stayed as it had always been, balanced, tempered, aware. The painting continued to change, though no one observed it. The chair returned. The door in the painted hallway closed, then opened again, then showed stairs, then mist, then a figure, indistinct. No one witnessed these changes firsthand, but still, they happened, as though the painting did not require attention to evolve, only memory, the kind that does not belong to one person, but to a place itself. The house had begun to dream its own dreams, and the painting was no longer a part of it. It was the origin. Years passed, and the house remained a quiet punctuation on the street, neither destination nor detour. Locals stopped speaking of it directly. They referred to it only in sideways glances, in pauses between other topics, as if naming it would grant it shape. Children were told not to play too near it, not from danger, but from diffusion, because those who lingered too long often forgot what they were playing in the first place. Teenagers dared each other to knock on the front door, but the door never answered. Once a girl claimed she saw a light inside late at night, not flickering like flame or flashing like electricity, but pulsing, a steady breath. Her friends laughed. She moved away the following year. One morning, a crow landed on the windowsill of the painted room. It tilted its head, once, twice, then tapped the glass with its beak. Inside the painting, a shadow crossed the doorway. The crow took flight. No one saw it. No one needed to. The house was no longer reacting to the world. It was echoing something deeper, something recursive. A loop folded inwards, each fold more familiar than the last. At some point, the painting ceased to be a painting. It became a behavior, a method of remembering that did not depend on eyes or minds. It adjusted without witnesses. The chair in the image wore dust that didn't exist. The floor showed footprints that had never been made. The door opened onto skies that didn't belong to any season. And then, without warning or cause, the painting went blank. Not erased, not unfinished. Just paused. A canvas devoid of form, yet dense with possibility. The frame remained. The wall did not change. But the absence on the canvas was loud, like a held breath, like silence before thunder. Anyone who might have seen it would have sworn they could hear color waiting behind that white. But no one came. The house stood quiet. The painting waited. And beyond the canvas, something watched. Far from the town, in a different city entirely, a child began to draw without instruction. The child had never seen the house, had no known relation to it. But the sketches came unbidden, rooms layered within rooms, stairs that climbed into fog, a chair, always empty, a doorway, always ajar. The child's parents encouraged the drawings, artistic perhaps, precocious, definitely, but the child stopped speaking, not from trauma, from focus, each sketch brought with it a strange quiet, as though the act of creation pulled sound from the air. At night, the child sat upright in bed, eyes open, hands miming brushstrokes over invisible canvases. The parents tried therapy. The therapist tried medication. Nothing stopped the motion. Eventually, the child drew the painting. Not a painting, but the painting, the room, the chair, the frame. But in this version, there was no figure, no light, just a canvas that bled outward into the walls. The child didn't explain, didn't name it, just drew it again and again, each time with more detail. Layers emerged, objects that hadn't been there in the last. A cracked teacup, a moth on the sill, a book with no title. The canvas within the image began to stretch, curve, fold into itself. Until finally, on one drawing, the child added something new. A shadow reaching toward the canvas, arm outstretched. The proportions were wrong. Longer than a human limb, softer at the edges. Not threatening, not welcoming, just present. That night, the child disappeared. The windows were locked. The door chained from within. No signs of struggle. Only the drawings remained, neatly stacked on the floor, with one taped to the wall above the bed. It showed the room again, but now. The canvas had changed. It held color, texture, movement. The painting was back. The house, wherever it was, had found a new observer. And that was enough. The house stirred. Not physically, not with groans or creaks or drafts, but conceptually. The rooms began to remember more vividly. The walls took on a warmer hue, not from paint but from recollection. Objects misplaced decades ago returned to drawers. A letter once torn in anger found itself reassembled beneath a windowsill. The mirror in the second hallway stopped reflecting strangers. Instead, it reflected the versions of people they had forgotten they had once been. No footsteps echoed, but the house felt occupied, not by bodies, but by events, by echoes of decisions that had never been made. The painting remained blank for some time after the child's disappearance, but it was not inert. It pulsed beneath the surface as though colors swam behind the veil of white. Visitors, rare though they were, described a sensation of being looked through. Not looked at, looked through, as if the painting was a lens and they were the projection. One plumber who entered to inspect a pipe turned back within minutes, pale and sweating. "There's someone already in that room," he muttered. But no one had entered. His tools were later found stacked neatly at the threshold. Then, one autumn evening, a shape returned to the canvas. Not a figure, not exactly. More like an intent shaped into form. A sloped presence defined by light and suggestion. Slowly the chair returned. Then the door. Then the window, cracked just slightly. The painted dust motes hung in painted light. And once again, the painting reflected a room that existed, though not quite the one in which it hung. The ceiling in the image was higher, the floor more worn, the walls subtly angled, a new version of the space, as if the painting had grown tired of mirroring and had begun to compose, not depiction, creation. The house adjusted again. The walls shifted by inches, the doorways slanted without creaking, and the painted room, once an imitation, became the most honest part of the house, a blueprint not of memory, but of intention. Something had decided to return, or perhaps it had never left. In a nearby town, a museum curator received an anonymous package. No return address, no stamps, just a wooden box sealed with wax and a single word etched into the lid: "Observe." Inside, wrapped in cloth the color of dusk, was a painting, or what seemed to be one. It was small, perhaps the size of a bathroom mirror, but heavy, disproportionately so. The frame was carved with symbols that shifted when looked at directly, refusing to be remembered. The image depicted a room, familiar in proportion, empty but expectant. A chair angled slightly to the left. A window that leaked a shaft of amber light. The curator didn't recall unwrapping it. One moment, it was in the box. The next, it hung on her office wall. Her co-workers noticed her growing distant. She stayed late, came early, often staring at the canvas for hours. She claimed to be researching its origin, but there were no signatures, no canvas marks, no materials to date. The paint itself defied categorization, not oil, not acrylic, not any known medium. When touched, it felt warm, not like sunlight or breath, but like something thinking. She tried to photograph it. Her phone bricked. She brought in a professional. His camera lens cracked, not from pressure, but from refusal. The painting would not be shared. It demanded presence. Soon, she stopped coming home. Her office light stayed on through the night. Other exhibits in the museum began to blur in public memory. Visitors claimed they remembered displays that never existed. One described a hallway of chairs, hundreds of them, each facing a different canvas. No such hallway existed in the building, yet the museum received postcards referencing it, drawings from school children who had seen it. Security footage showed no such installation, but the air in that wing felt heavier, saturated with attention. The painting in her office shifted weekly, not in content, but in clarity. Each time someone blinked, it seemed closer to finishing something, a composition just on the edge of resolution. The curator took notes at first, then stopped. Not because the changes ceased, but because the notes began to appear before the changes happened. She would write of a crack in the floor, only to find it in the canvas the next morning, or describe a breeze, and later feel it brushing her shoulder. The painting was no longer static. It was predictive, or persuasive, or both. The curator disappeared the following winter. No theft, no signs of struggle, just an unlocked office and a painting on the wall that had grown larger. No one remembered who authorized its installation. No one remembered her full name. Only fragments. She wore gray, or she always had tea at 4. The museum listed her as a temporary consultant and quietly closed the wing. The painting remained, but no placard was placed. No artist noted. When guests asked, guides simply smiled and said, "That room isn't part of the tour, Art." But word spread. Those who saw the painting began to speak of similar things. A room in their dreams, a door that always led to the same hallway, a silence that remembered them. Artists started sketching shapes they couldn't name. Architects designed homes with an extra room they couldn't account for. A filmmaker abandoned a project because every frame returned to a single chair, unbidden. The painting had begun to echo through people who had never seen it, never touched it, never known it by name. Yet it shaped their choices, gently, unshakably. And always, in each version, there was a canvas. Sometimes blank, sometimes full, sometimes open. It was no longer a painting. It was an idea dressed in pigment, a location within attention, a space that existed wherever it was observed deeply enough. The curator's notes, what few remained, hinted at this. "It isn't in the house," one line read. "The house is in it." Another. "We think we look at art, but sometimes it looks back, and sometimes it remembers us better than we remember ourselves." Eventually, the museum sealed the room, not out of fear, out of courtesy, as one might close the door to a room where someone is still working. The painting remained, silent, watchful, patient. And somewhere, far from the gallery, a child began to draw again. A chair, a window, a door, and always a canvas. That changed in the dark. Somewhere between thought and place, the painting continued. Not in the museum, not in the house, but in the thin membrane where memory becomes pattern. It no longer waited for walls to hang on. Instead, it nested inside attention, like a shadow that remembers how you stood when no one else does. It began to surface in the liminal, glimpsed between elevator doors, reflected in passing glass, tucked behind dreams that didn't feel like dreams. Those who saw it never claimed to have seen it directly. Rather, they spoke of impressions, the way a room felt painted after one blink too long, the way a hallway they'd known for years suddenly leaned, as if framed, the way silence pooled around certain objects like light would, if light had weight. The painting no longer appeared where it was looked for. It appeared where it was unnoticed, and it brought with it the same room, the same chair, the same unfolding door. A writer in Lisbon began drafting stories that always circled back to a quiet room with a crooked frame. He had never visited the town, never heard of the museum. But each of his manuscripts, no matter the starting point, concluded in the same place, beneath a painting that changed once the protagonist left the scene. He tried other genres, poetry, memoir, even recipes, all turned inward, all curved into the same image. A woman in Jakarta began photographing corners, not people, not architecture, just corners, the way light pooled in them, the way dust arranged itself. Her lens always found a void, and in the center of that void, something almost like brush strokes. Her hard drive later revealed thousands of images she didn't remember taking. Most were black, but when adjusted for contrast, each showed a chair, different rooms, same angle, same silence. And the painting grew bolder, not louder, not brighter, but more certain. It began erasing space before it filled it, whole hours lost to staring at blank walls, sketchbooks emptied of ink despite no visible markings, conversations that stopped mid-sentence, replaced by the hush of an idea too large to speak aloud. People began describing the same dream without having met, a staircase descending into a gallery lit by no source, a single canvas at the far end, approached, never reached. The details varied, but the core was the same, a presence that could not be forgotten, only misplaced, a room that lived in the bones of time, waiting for the right observer to give it name again. The painting no longer needed to hang. It had begun to dwell, in minds, in patterns, in spaces where no narrative could quite form, but where meaning trembled just beneath the edge of articulation. A painting that changed, always in the dark, not to frighten, but to remember. In a quiet library in Krakow, a scholar specializing in memory studies began to chart what she called the visual recursion of mnemonic decay. Her diagrams started as abstract exercises, maps of how images returned in slightly altered form after trauma or repetition, but her notes slowly curved toward obsession. She began sketching rooms between pages of research. She found herself returning to the same configuration, a rectangular space with a single chair, an open door, and a frame hanging at a tilt. She didn't recognize the space, not from life or literature, and yet it grew familiar, like a word half recalled from a childhood lullaby. She once dreamed she was giving a lecture, only to realize mid-sentence that every face in the audience had been replaced by painted versions of themselves, still listening and slowly darkening. She awoke not frightened but hollow, as if something important had been spoken, but she hadn't heard it. Over weeks, her notebooks began to carry images she couldn't remember drawing, not just architectural sketches but whole sequences. A hallway turning into a stairwell, a figure seated beside a canvas too large for the wall. The ink always dried too quickly. Pages warped as though they had been left under pressure. When she flipped through them, a rhythm emerged, an almost cinematic progression of space folding into space, frame into frame. She stopped showing her work to colleagues, not out of secrecy but out of doubt. These weren't findings anymore. They were invitations, and the last page she ever submitted to the archive contained only 2 words, carefully lettered in dark ink. It waits. The library eventually boxed her belongings and stored them in an unused room upstairs. Years later, a junior archivist rediscovered the box and opened it. Inside, the papers were intact, but every page had changed. Not entirely, not dramatically, just slightly. The angles sharper, the shadows deeper, the chair now angled differently, the figure seated further back, and in the final folder, a new sketch entirely. The painting, within a frame, within a wall, within a room that looked exactly like the library's archive room, except that in the drawing, the door was closed. Elsewhere, a man renovating a farmhouse discovered a sealed panel behind a layer of old plaster. No one had mentioned it in the records, no blueprint acknowledged the space. The panel resisted crowbars, drills, even heat, Eventually, in a fit of frustration, he left it alone. That night, he dreamed of a room behind that wall, a room that breathed gently in darkness, with floorboards that inhaled and exhaled beneath dustless rugs. When he woke, the wall was unsealed, not broken, not open, just different. The panel now bore a fine line across its middle, like a lid once closed, now slightly ajar. He stepped back. The space smelled faintly of oil and cedar, and though the wall remained still, the house felt expectant, as though something had been acknowledged. The next morning, in the dust of the floor beneath the panel, he found faint brush marks. No paint, just strokes, as though the air itself had been combed. He tried to paint over the wall, 3 coats, each peeled within hours, not in flakes, but in ribbons, as though being unwrapped. Eventually he hung a bookshelf over it and said nothing more, but the books there began to warp. Their pages curled inward. Their titles shifted when viewed from the side. One afternoon a neighbor came to visit and asked what was behind the shelf. The man couldn't answer. He remembered the wall. He remembered the dream. But suddenly he no longer remembered what it had looked like, only that it had changed. That night, he removed the shelf and found no panel. Just smooth wall, as if it had never been opened, never been sealed. But when he looked closer, he noticed the faint outline of a rectangle, frame-like, centered just so. He turned off the lights, and for a moment the shape pulsed with color he couldn't name. At the edge of a dense forest in northern Finland, a hiker discovered a cabin not marked on any map. It was small, moss-covered, with a roof that sloped in the wrong direction, away from the sun. Curious, he entered. The inside was clean. No dust, no rot, just stillness. On the far wall hung a painting, or perhaps a window. It was hard to tell. It showed a room that mirrored the cabin itself, down to the knot in the floorboard, the tilt in the ceiling. But the image inside was deeper, stretching into a hallway that couldn't fit within the actual space. He blinked. The hallway deepened. He stepped forward. His foot creaked on a board, and in the painting, the same board moved. He didn't stay long. When he returned with others the next day, the cabin was gone. Not burned, not dismantled, just absent. In its place, a clearing, smooth as breath, no footprints, no indentation in the moss. But the hikers all reported the same dream that night. A room without echo, a chair facing a frame, a light that knew too much. Back in their homes, their windows grew colder, their reflections delayed, and the photographs taken in the forest came back blank in the center. Pure white squares edged by trees, as if a space had been deliberately forgotten by the film. The hiker never spoke of it again, but he stopped entering buildings. He began camping in open spaces, refused to stand near framed mirrors. His journals, found after his disappearance, contained pages of diagrams, not maps, but geometries of observation, notes on light angles, sketches of rooms viewed from above. And on the final page, a sentence written in hurried script: "It is no longer inside the house is inside it." There came a moment, perhaps unrecorded, when the painting ceased to be a singular event. It became a pattern, not a copy, not a contagion, a rhythm in consciousness. It threaded itself into design, into architecture, into language. The way people began avoiding certain corners without knowing why. The way architects stopped including fourth rooms in floor plans. The way a small percentage of people began remembering a house that had never existed in their town, yet could all describe the same hallway, the same chair, the same hum. It was not shared memory. It was synchrony, a wave of perception folding into form. The painting, once a canvas, now wore the shape of recurrence. In academic circles, someone gave it a name. Not a scientific one, just a term to hold the shape of the conversation. The recursion frame. Others called it the quiet architecture, but no term held for long, because as soon as it was named, it shifted. It didn't want to be owned. It didn't want to be explained. It wanted only to be witnessed, again and again, by those who wouldn't speak of it. And so, It began appearing in things left unspoken, in background props of forgotten films, in the wallpaper pattern of a waiting room no one returned to, in the negative space between lampposts on foggy nights. The painting changed only when no one tried to catch it. It taught patience. It taught reverence. It taught the danger of looking too long. And always, wherever it appeared, it brought with it the memory of the original room, the one with the chair, the one with the open door, the one whose floor was not walked upon but remembered. The painting had become not a thing to find, but a thing that found you, when your thoughts curled too tightly, when your breath slowed at the sight of certain light, when your dream walked ahead of your body. It would be there, behind the surface, inside the silence, waiting. In the end, if such things end at all, the painting was never about the image. It was about the act of seeing, of attention bending space, of repetition becoming presence. No one ever owned it. No one ever claimed authorship. It could not be bought, traded, or burned, because it was not on canvas anymore. It was in memory, in architecture, in the arrangement of stillness between two moments. The last recorded sighting came from an old woman in Marseille, who described a room in her retirement home that did not appear on any map. She found it only once, on a cloudy afternoon. Inside was a single chair, facing a blank canvas. But as she approached, her own reflection took shape in the surface, not as she was, but as she had been decades ago, holding a brush she never remembered lifting. She sat down in the chair, and the door closed behind her, not as a trap, but as a frame. Her absence was not reported for weeks. Her room was cleared. Her name slowly faded from records, but in a gallery across the continent, a new painting appeared. No one knew who hung it. No one remembered opening the shipment. But there it was, unlabeled, unsigned. A room, a chair, a figure seated, staring outward, and in the figure's eyes, the glimmer of a frame within a frame, another canvas, waiting. And beneath that painting, for the first time in recorded history, a caption appeared, just 3 words: "Do not remember."